So you've picked question 3. Question 3 had 3 segments to it, so 2 definition questions and the 6-mark essay. You'll hopefully have noticed that all of the section A questions have a 6-mark response in it. It's just the first 4 marks that might either come in a 2-mark or a single 4-mark form. Now, depending on the question choices, sometimes you're better going with a 4-mark identifier than you are going with 2 definitions, because it's really easy to lose that second definition mark if you're not super clear about how you're defining your terms. But let's see how you did anyway. So the first definition you needed to include for question 3 was a definition of stakeholders. And this definition, it's really nice and clean and should be quite easy to remember. It's just about getting one key word right. So a stakeholder is any person or organization, part 1, who has a vested interest, part 2, in the business, okay? So there's 2 key parts here. Person or organization with a vested interest in the business. And it's as simple as that. If you make that statement, you're going to get 2 marks. Definition question marks are broken down, so you get 1 mark for a vague kind of idea and 2 marks for being really clear in your definition. Let's move on to definition 2. So definition 2 asked you to define an entrepreneur. Now, if you've done enterprise in the past, it may be that your definition was slightly off relative to what we're seeking in the IB program. We definitely still want to see terms like risk-taking and decision-making, but it's incredibly important for the definition of an entrepreneur that you make reference to starting up a business, okay? In enterprise, we talk about entrepreneurs in that context, but we tend to suggest that you're enterprising in other areas as well, whereas in this context, we're specifically looking at a person who is starting a business, okay? So key parts of the definition: a person who is starting a business, taking risks, making decisions to achieve successful outcomes, okay? You could also have included things in the entrepreneur definition that, like, they operate and they assume the risk, so they're willing to take it on. There's some cleaner phrasing you could be using here, but the key is to have those kind of 2 parts to it, that they're starting up the business and that they're doing this risk-taking, decision-making, operational stuff as well, all right? So those are your 2 definitions, and that kind of wraps up your part 1 of the question. The second part of the question is obviously the 6-mark essay. Now, the 6-mark essay, I suppose you can split your answer into 2 parts of it. It has content, so it has the information and the examples and the arguments that you provide. And then it has criteria, and the criteria are the structural elements we're looking for. So in the case of the criteria, we'll start there. There are 6 marks, and we break those 6 marks into 3 bands or levels of response, okay? So at level 1, you're getting 1 to 2 marks out of 6, and at that level, you're not displaying particularly strong responses in some key areas. So the areas we're looking at are your understanding and relevance. So in other words, have you selected information and theory that is relevant to the question, and have you explained it clearly, okay? The second thing we're looking for is your use of business terminology and language. So have you kind of just described it in layman's terms, or have you really used the business terminology? If you find you're a bit weak in this area, it's a really good idea to start developing a glossary and then building that vocabulary, practicing using it. It can also be helpful to read a bit more business news or business text. So it can be news, it can be media, it can be blogs, just to see that language being used a little bit more frequently. The third part, of course, is the case study reference. So you need to make significant reference to the case in this response. Now, if you're in band 1, you may have mentioned the name, so you might have said Innocent Drinks, for example, or you might have mentioned the owners, but you only made sort of a general reference to them. You haven't really talked about what they've done, how they connect. The example is not substantial. Band 2 is obviously marks 3 and 4, and in Band 2 you're probably doing some of the things but not all of the things, and you might have even achieved some strong elements. So you might have shown really good theory and understanding. Okay, your knowledge and relevance section is great, but you're still not making any reference to the case study. So that strong point and that super weak point kind of band you in the middle. And then obviously at the top band, marks 5 and 6, you're consistently showing good use of terminology, correct theory, relevant issues, and you're using the case to back up all of the arguments that you're making. Just to be clear, a 6 marker doesn't require you to reach a conclusion, but it does require balance. So you should be showing 2 perspectives or sides to the argument. Which brings me to the content section. So in this question, we're looking at how having a strong ethical perspective or stance is a benefit for innocent drinks. Now, even though we're directing you in the question towards what is the benefit, you still need to consider the weaknesses, okay? So split it in 2. What are the good things? What are the bad things? So some of the good things you might have chosen to talk about, you could have made reference to it providing direction. So a strong ethical stance gives good direction to a company like Innocence, because it tells the staff what to prioritize, it tells consumers what they're getting, it helps make decisions because it simplifies them down to, does this fall into our ethical window or not? So it gives kind of clear direction. It also acts as a unique selling point. There are not a lot of businesses that maintain a really strong ethical front. That doesn't mean lots of businesses are unethical, but they're not taking it to a level that they're using it as a vision of who they are. So having a business that kind of puts ethics front and center is a unique selling point for them. It enables them to get other customers. It might enable them to get better employees who value the same thing. You might also have talked about the fact that this ethical stance motivates stakeholders. So it motivates them to want to support the organization, to get involved, to buy more products, to sell more products, to make a better product. All of those things come from that ethical stance. And it can be profitable. Ethics can be profitable. We know that there are increasing numbers of people who value social concern. So ethics is a saleable asset these days, and that's important to think about. On the flip side, okay, there are some downsides to it. Being highly ethical can be expensive, okay? So it can cost money. For example, in this case, 10% of all sales revenue. So there are potentially financial pitfalls to it. The circumstances might change. So the business starts with this strong ethical stance, but then a merger with another company happens, like Coca-Cola coming along. Can you maintain that? Does it become a barrier to you being able to do other things? It might be misconstrued. People might misinterpret what you're saying, you know. It could be interpreted as overly judgmental. It could be interpreted as you doing one thing and then you're actually doing something else, and so now you're judged as not fulfilling what you say you're going to. That's a really kind of messy or complicated section of that. You can also have to think about the fact that some consumers might not really appreciate it. They might just want a product, and so if they don't appreciate what you're doing, they might think, well, why is the price so high? I don't understand why it's so hard for me to get your product, because they don't care. And perhaps that's not your target market, but you do have to consider it. Now, if this were a more analytical question, so let's say more of a 10 marker, although you could make reference in the 6 marker, you might go on to comment on the strength of some of these arguments. So for example, how important is it that some consumers might not appreciate your ethical values? Well, in Innocent's case, maybe it's not very important because they've got a target market of people they're trying to reach. And if you don't fall into that market, well, that's okay. Alternatively, they're trying to expand. So maybe it is really important. This is the kind of developed discussion that you want to be achieving. And that gives you a 6 marker.